Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, The Power of Indigenous Food Sovereignty series, Dietitian perspectives and stories about the impacts of colonization on Indigenous health and food systems with Tatyana, Seamus, Michael, and Gerry. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Seraine Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle manager. I'm Seal Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and she will be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. Finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you're looking after yourself, and if at any point in time you feel like you need to talk to an elder, friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves.
Cusik Cukit, good day. Segoli, Seamus, Nian Getz, at Noel Noon Geekdalo. Hello, everyone. My name is Seamus. I am an uninvited Oneida guest on the ancestral and unceded Amakis Tunaha, the traditional territory of the Tunaha Nation. Specifically, I'm calling in from my home office in Kukanamon, colonial name or commonly known as Kimberley, BC. I am a son, I am a brother, I'm a partner to an amazing fiance, and I'm an Indigenous person living away from my homelands and on the path to reclaim my identity and what it means to be Oneida. Finally, I work as a public health dietitian with Interior Health, working on a variety of local, regional, and provincial food-related projects. And it's just an honor to be able to share some virtual space with Tatyana, Gerry, and Michael, all of whom I've learned so much from over the last couple of years and I look up to. So Yawa, thank you. And I'll pass it over to the next person, which I can't remember, Seraine.
Tatyana.
Tatyana.
I'm a Helu. Thingy Gatigam Hanak Kamkabusa. Guramakambulis Wai, Tatyana Daniels Wai, Lobs Malula, Klasel Pedek, Losiuth Nii, Lobs Kaslam, Lakibu Pedek. So hi everyone, my name is Tatyana. My Gitsan name is Shining Star. I am Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en, and I grew up in the community of Dietitian in northern BC. And right now I am working as a community dietitian and I cover 55 First Nations communities in northern BC. And I think I'll pass it on to the next one for now.
Michael?
Thank you. Simgiya Sigidamanak Jantkabolosa, Amasilfa, Amahil Kaman Kiachlach Wai, Michael Wesley, Amshawai, Wops Mululak, Laksel Kadiki. My name is Michael Wesley. I've been a dietitian for the past few years. Since I've graduated at UBC, I started my own business working as a contractor with Indigenous communities as well as organizations on projects related to Indigenous health. So I was born and raised on a small reserve called Gidinmax, just like Tatyana. We actually grew up in the same household at different times, so different generations. And so I was born and raised on Gidinmax. My father is from Gitskipla, small reserve in the Gitsan territory. My mother is from Gidinmax as well. Yeah, amongst other things, aside from working and contracts, I hold a position with New North Tribal Council, in which I'm one of the dietitians there. There are 3 different dietitians, and around that work, I focus on diabetes work with communities around the northern region of New North. I'm a father of 2 boys, 8 and 6-year-old, and I am also a husband been married for 10 years now this year. Yeah. Thank you. Pass it on to Gerry.
Hey everyone, I'm Gerry Kasten. I'm English and Scottish on my mother's side and German on my father's side. I'm calling in today from Kemkemele, which of course Coast Salish land for the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. I like to note that I have benefited from colonization. My grandfather and his brother came to Alberta in 1907 and were given land by the government that had been taken from the Plains Cree. Because of the bounty of that land, my father was able to attend university, and I, in turn, have been able to seek and gain education. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the debt that I owe to the land.
Thank you. Thank you all for introducing yourselves and sharing where you were calling in from. We're gonna just jump right into the discussion with the dietitians. The first question is, what does Indigenous food sovereignty mean to you, your community, and why is it important? And we'll start with Michael.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Indigenous food sovereignty means a lot to me. It's the whole reason why I got into dietetics myself. As you know, I used to work in trades for like 10 years, and then it wasn't working out in terms of like myself recognizing the colonial structures of trade systems, and I wanted to do something that was more, it wasn't very rewarding as a tradesman. So I wanted to do something where I could try to work and help communities like the one that I grew up in. And eventually I just kind of worked my thoughts into, I'm going to be a dietitian, because dietitians can work with food sovereignty and food security. So there's, looking at this question, I think there's a lot of ways to break it down. The terminology, what does Indigenous food sovereignty mean to me as a dietitian, as a Gitsan dietitian? So there's a lot of things here. Indigenous can mean different things to different people, depending on where you are in the world. To me, Indigenous is First Nations people that I'm working with in BC, and the definition of food sovereignty, breaking it down to what is that? What does food sovereignty mean? It means we have access and we get to choose and have rights to determine what we want to have access to and how we access those foods in terms of like hunting and fishing. And so there's that aspect of Indigenous food sovereignty, and I think it's very vital to overall health as well. So that's why it would be very important. That's why it's important to me, is like eventually, like I'm, as I mentioned, working in trades, I wanted to help Indigenous peoples and like the community, the reserve that I grew up in, Gitimax. So I wanted to try to make a difference in what I've seen and experienced, seeing a lot of elders and relatives succumbing to chronic diseases, and those are some of the things that I value, that I want. Those are some of the priorities that I want to address with my profession as a dietitian now. Yeah, I think I'll pass that over to if somebody else wants to touch on that question.
Yeah, we'll pass it over to Seamus.
Thank you, Serene, and yeah, thank you, Michael, for kind of highlighting a few of the pieces that when I reflect on this question, I think it goes back to kind of my story and how I was going through becoming a dietitian, and concurrently during that time, I was also learning who I was as an Indigenous person, as Oneida. And I think it was a relatively new term when I went to school. But what I've learned now is that it is not a new term for many Indigenous folks. This is interconnected, as Michael was saying, to our culture, to our stories. And I think the one piece for me when I kind of unpack Indigenous food sovereignty, I'm reminded that I can only describe food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty, and what it means to me, and recognize that each community, each individual will define it a different way or describe it a bit different, and that sometimes as dietitians we want to have things black and white and have things defined and whatnot, but we have to be comfortable with that uncomfortable feeling of not having a definition for Indigenous food sovereignty, and really respecting that self-determination that Michael had brought up for Indigenous communities to really decide and have control over their land, how they choose to access the food which grows on it. And the one piece, as I've been going through my journey, that I've kind of landed on, and I think it's connected to why it's so important, is I often hear Don Morrison talk about, the one piece around Indigenous food sovereignty, that is this idea of it being sacred. And I resonate with that piece, because as an Indigenous person who is away from my own homelands and my own community, I understand that by listening to my own creation story and also hearing from other creation stories, food is a gift from the Creator. And when you center it at that kind of spiritual level, you recognize that the food in which we consume, it is a gift from Creator, it is from the land, and we're inherently connected to the land. And so I think that has so much weight, and it's not just that black and white thing that this is what Indigenous food sovereignty means. So that was that's where I land with this piece. And I know, again, there's a lot to unpack, and how I see Indigenous food sovereignty will likely change in the next few years, in the next 10 years, as I become more connected with my own community, and also listening to the stories of Ktunaxa folks and other folks that I get to share space with. My experience will likely change how I view Indigenous food sovereignty.
Thank you, Seamus. Can we hear from Tatyana?
Hi, everyone. So Indigenous food sovereignty has been really important to me throughout my life, and I didn't realize that I was actually doing Indigenous food sovereignty work when I was young. I grew up with both my parents, their families, or my families having a really strong cultural connection to our cultural foods and our traditional ways of preserving salmon. So I remember going out to my dad's community, and I was really young, but we got to see how the salmon was being smoked, and we got to just take it right off the rack and use some little butter and salt on it. And then I thought that was just amazing food, and then I just kind of fell in love with salmon. My grandma always taught me about the nutritional impacts of salmon and how it's beneficial for our health. And so I got really connected to food and our land and food systems when I was young. I also have relatives who have been frontline land protectors and family that use their voice to defend the rights of our traditional foods in our land. But food sovereignty is also really important in terms of food security. When I was growing up, I experienced food insecurity, and so my grandmother would always tell me that if I didn't help out, or if I wouldn't learn how to do my own fish, we would be hungry in the winter. And so she really emphasized the importance of our foods for food security. When I was 15, I actually wrote an opinion piece for a national Indigenous newspaper, which to my surprise was published and printed, but I was really young at the time, and every now and then I go back and look at it and kind of chuckle to myself because of my lack of academic writing skills. But I really see the passion in my words and how strongly I believed in myself to speak up on this topic. because in this article, I highlighted the importance of salmon in our culture, the importance of the intergenerational knowledge transfer between grandparents, parents, aunties and uncles and cousins, and more. And so I really harped on, like, we need to be protecting our lands from different land projects, because at the time there was a pipeline being proposed through our traditional territories on Getsan Lakieb. And so that's how I got especially involved with advocacy. And as I got into university, I had a really great professor named Will Valley who really believed in me and my voice, and that really gave me the confidence to continue to speak out about Indigenous food sovereignty and the importance of food security for myself and for my community. And going into dietetics, I really got to learn a lot more in depth about food and the food systems and the environment within the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. And so I think going to UBC was also really impactful for me to use my voice in academic settings and to do things like this webinar. I don't know if I totally answered the question because I got a bit nervous, but
I think you did a great job.
Okay, thank you.
And then Gerry?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Everything that I think about Indigenous food sovereignty has been talked about already. I think that the things that Tatyana mentioned about the importance of passing food knowledge from aunties and uncles down through the generations, and the importance of sovereignty, that people need to be in charge of their own food, and as Seamus was talking about, the importance of allowing communities to define that for themselves. And then most critically, some of the things that Mike talked about land and control over land in order to be able to access food.
Yes, you hit it home with that summarization. Thank you, Gerry. I really appreciate you guys answering this question. We'll move on to the next question. How does food sovereignty and or food system work relate to Indigenous health, wellness, and culture? We'll start with Tatyana.
So in Getsan teachings, we're taught that the land is kind of central to our culture, and so the health of the land equals the health of our people. And so I think directly when you talk about food sovereignty and having sovereignty over the decisions on how we choose which foods that we want to enjoy and which foods make us feel good, and it's more than just physical health and wellness that food sovereignty and food system work relates to. It's Indigenous health in a holistic perspective. So for example, when I moved away for school, I really had to rely on the canned salmon that my grandmother made for me because I was experiencing food insecurity in my first year. And it was also a source of like emotional and spiritual support, because I would always feel a lot more rejuvenated after I had some canned salmon, because I had that connection to home and connection to our traditional foodways in our land. So I think this work is directly related to Indigenous health and wellness, and preserving our culture in the traditional ways that we do process food and learn about the teachings and respect for the food that we do consume.
Thank you. Gerry?
So for this, it really always resonates for me around food sovereignty and culture, because food is such a critical aspect to cultural sharing within groups. And so ensuring that people not only have the sovereignty, but the ability to share. Also, the other thing that really occurs to me about food system work is the interruption to Indigenous food systems through colonization. And I think folks like Don Morrison have done amazing work around tracing the grease trails and not only looking at sovereignty, but also trade and the larger indigenous food system. And so that work is critically important because it communicates that these systems were in place long before colonization and were very successful and were built around culture.
Thank you for that. I'll pass it over to Seamus.
Yeah, thank you, Seraine. And yeah, I echo the themes that Gerry and Tatyana had brought up so eloquently around that interconnection between food, land, culture. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had many years ago with a Tunaha elder by the name of Herman Alpine, who described, and I've heard this described in conversations that I've had recently with elders and knowledge holders in community, where the reminder that food is connected with language, and language, of course, is connected with culture. And Herman would describe the pieces of the loss of the Tunaha language being an endangered language, and the worry that once you lose one's language, you lose aspects of culture, and therefore you are also losing pieces of food sovereignty and for communities to be food secure. Yet with all of the impacts of, as Gerry was highlighting, of colonization, communities are reclaiming their language and fighting back and whatnot. And so yeah, I just find how important and how interconnected things are. And when we're in my role as a public health dietitian, I need to be very mindful of not siloing things and not wanting to categorize conversations or put things into boxes, because food security work is directly connected with poverty reduction, which is then connected with housing, etc. And that reminder that, yeah, everything is interconnected. And when I look back on my own story, I remember a time where I phoned up my grandmother. Again, my grandmother never really talked about her story and never really shared with us what being Oneida meant. Yet, when we were talking about making some hoyans, which are these Oneida fried donuts, and I was telling her, oh yeah, I'm going to put them in the oven, and that's what the recipe says. And she kind of freaked out and said, no, that's not how my auntie did it. And it was just that reminder, even though it appeared that she was removed from community or removed to culture, she could tell me a story, and it was around food. She was like, this is how it's connected. This is important because. And so just reiterating that piece, you can't separate you can't separate the health of Indigenous people from food system work, from land land back conversations, etc. And so yeah, anyways, I'm starting to go on a bit of a rambly piece, but I just wanted to reiterate that interconnection is so important. And as dietitians, sometimes we want the black and white, and it's not black and white. There's nuance there, and being okay and being comfortable with that nuance is really important. Maybe I'll just pass it over to Michael if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Seamus. I love these questions. They're great questions. There's a lot of deep thought behind them, and I love sitting down with everyone here. It's just always a great conversation. I learned so much sitting with Tatyana, Gerry, and Seamus and having conversations like this. I just wanted to go back to that last question, actually. What does food sovereignty mean to me? I had a bit more to add to that. I think as a dietitian, since I've become a dietitian, I've been learning there's so many different levels to food sovereignty. I was more familiar at a younger age with food sovereignty being like a grassroots initiative. Getting into more contract work, I've been working with organizations and realizing like food sovereignty on the policy levels and higher levels and what the work looks like around there. And I think there's really a lot to learn about food sovereignty in terms of all of these different levels and how they interconnect. As Seamus mentioned, everything's really interconnected. And I really appreciate that comment as well, because to me, that's Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge is looking at things as a holistic level. So yeah, a bit more on food sovereignty from my perspective, and how does food sovereignty and food systems work relating to Indigenous health. So I'm thinking about a lot of conversations I have with elders as well, like Seamus has mentioned what he's been doing with his grandmother and elders in the Oneida. My grandmother, Tatyana mentioned her grandmother. So my grandmother, Miriam Danes, she passed away a few years ago. One of the last things that I remember her saying to me, and it's always going to stay with me, is that our people are getting sick and dying because we don't eat our traditional foods anymore. And the traditional foods, to me, that's food sovereignty. And Gerry mentioned how these systems existed long before Canada has come into existence. And so that's food sovereignty to me. That's the traditional foods and the food systems and the culture. And the things that I've been looking at surrounding that are asking elders, what it was like before, and asking if there are, Seamus also mentioned language. The language, are there words for all these chronic diseases that we see today in our communities? And the answers that I'm getting are there are no words for diabetes, and because they weren't needed back then, to me indicating that the health was much more healthier before colonization, really. And these chronic diseases didn't exist because we were living in systems that addressed all of these issues before they become problematic. And when you look at Canada's statistics today, the leading causes of death for First Nations people are all these chronic diseases such as cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's is starting to get in there, heart disease. All of these issues are leading causes of death in First Nations people, and they've only really come prevalent in the last, since Canada really started the colonization of reserve systems and residential schools. And to me, so as I mentioned, food sovereignty really can address, I believe that it can address those health issues. And there are a lot of different interactions and barriers within the environment and the communities that make it harder just to jump right back into traditional foods. And a lot of that is colonization really broke down the cultures and limited our knowledge. So it's just for me, it's trying to relearn a lot of things. And how do I adapt that to this modern way of living that in the society that we live in today? And for me personally, I think it has worked wonders. Indigenous health is my passion, so I do what I can, and I think it's very important moving forward for Indigenous health to make positive changes. And in order to do that, we gotta focus on these food systems, traditional food sovereignty movements, and that's going to be a little bit different from community to community and to individual.
Thank you, Michael. That kind of leads into our next question. Just wait for the slide to go. Can you explain the impact of colonization on Indigenous food systems? We'll start with Gerry.
Mercy me, it's like where to start. As Mike has already mentioned, it's things like the reserve system and residential schools that people were confined to reserves, so they lost the ability to work within Indigenous food systems that had existed for millennia. And then in turn, in residential schools, there was a loss of access to traditional foods, and there was a whole variety of, first off, unfamiliar foods introduced, and secondly, poor quality foods and restricted amounts of foods. So I want to sort of move quickly through this. To me, one of the key things is the reserve system and the loss of access to land. The other is that arising from the reserve system and residential schooling is the inherent poverty that Indigenous peoples have been placed into. And, you know, as we know from a wide variety of studies, poverty is an initiator of chronic disease. And so anyways, a very brief overview that I hope the others can build upon when we talk about the impacts of colonization.
Thank you, Gerry. We'll pass it to Seamus.
Thank you, Seraine. And yeah, very big question. And Gerry kind of highlighted briefly some of those key pieces, the unfortunate pieces, but we need to bring the truth about them and keep reminding folks about these systems like the residential school system. I think how I'm going to approach this question is maybe just sharing a bit more about where I find myself today. And again, my story of someone who has never been back to my home community out in Southern Ontario, not until the last few years, actually trying to reclaim my identity. And the idea of having to reclaim identity is a direct impact of colonization, and a similar story for many folks across Turtle Island. And unfortunately, colonization is still happening across the world. One of the things I find is that when we talk about colonization, we have to be reminded that it's still happening today. There are still colonial impacts that are impacting our community, our family, our land. And one of the pieces that I was reminded about when I was going to school, actually at UBC, and trying to become a dietitian, was that it wasn't until my fourth year in the program that I was presented with Ian Mosby's research about dietitians and nutritionists' role and the role of food, as Gerry was highlighting, in residential school. And I think that is the one piece we often hear when I'm in like dietitian or food conversations, the power of food and how it can be a big a piece to bring the conversation of belonging and bringing people in. And that's very true. But food has also been used in the past as a colonial weapon. And so being mindful of how, and it continues to be when we think of the impacts of corporations on Indigenous land and the impacts of some of those pieces. Anyways, starting to ramble off, but yeah, I just wanted to, when I think back to my story and how this crazy idea that I have to reclaim who I am as Oneida, and that and for many reasons, and them being that my grandmother, I believe that my grandmother wanted to protect us, didn't want us to experience this stuff that she did. And that breaks my heart. And yeah, so just to kind of wrap up all of my meandering thoughts here, as a public health dietitian, bringing it back to work that I do, it's that reminder that when I'm using terms like food is, food is unlock the power of food and the importance of it, I have to be very mindful and take a trauma-informed approach to how we talk about food, because it can be quite traumatic, whether it's when we're in clinical care, thinking about meal plans and why isn't this person eating their oatmeal? Well, maybe there are more reasons than just that you have to dive in. So I'm going to maybe pass it over to the next person to weed through some of the stuff that I just said and maybe build upon what Gerry was highlighting. But yeah, the impacts of colonization continue. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Seamus. We'll pass it over to Tatyana.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that colonization has done to impact Indigenous food systems. And I remember a few years ago, I was reading a timeline about the history of Agitsan people. And I remember reading that our hunting and fishing were actually illegal. And that there was a time in our history where there was an explosion and they wanted to block off the salmon run from us. And so they directly physically impacted our food source at that time. I am not quite sure of the date of that, but that was something that was really surprising to me, to have that happen to our main source of sustenance, and that has happened in our history. But in the modern day context, there's all of the land projects that are being proposed across our Gitxsan Lehiyip and other Indigenous territories across Aridal Island or North America. And that is really impacting Indigenous food systems in terms of like, if there's any disasters for a land project that directly impacts the salmon in our rivers, and if there's a lot of runoff within the river, there's impacts of that. I lost my thought. This topic is really large to cover, so I'll let my uncle Mike add a bit more.
Thank you, Tatyana. Your BE. That's our Gitxsan language for uncle, BE. And a little shout out to an old friend, Wilson Mendez, who me and Tatyana became close with. He used to call me BE anytime he seen me, because Tatyana would always call me uncle in front of him. And, so he learned the Gitxsan word BE, and he would call me BE. Yes, so uncle just reminded me of Wilson and Tatyana, so I just wanted to shout out to Wilson. Yeah, and so can you explain the impact of colonization on Indigenous food sovereignty? As Tatyana mentioned, such a huge topic and a big question, a very important question as well, one that I explore often, daily. I think I want to sidetrack a little with the story of going back to why I became a dietitian and expanding on that a little bit more, because it kind of relates to the question. And so the story of me becoming a dietitian, I was working in a trades job, construction, just doing the same thing over and over, very mundane and very unrewarding, and just very tired of it. Non-social, there's nothing relating to my culture at all, and very displacing myself from my culture, and started to think about why I was in that position anyways. And so started to do a lot of self-reflection. Even back then, I didn't realize that's what I was doing. It's just thinking about my history and my life, and realizing it. Everybody in my community really kind of goes in this route of, these different types of trades jobs, and I started thinking, why does everybody do that? So eventually came to residential schools. They didn't teach us to be, health professionals and doctors, lawyers, whatever. What they're really training our people to be were, laborers and help. And so I didn't agree with that, and I wanted to break that cycle, and made the choice to leave trades to become a dietitian. And what I was doing at that time, as well as recognizing the environment around me and the environment within my community, and how that really motivated me to go this direction. So with that is like how, like, eventually realizing it wasn't really my choice to be in the trades, it's just kind of the environment that kind of pushed me that way, I felt. And so I was recognizing that and wanted to break that. And how this relates to this question is, you know, another side story is that recently I went to a different type of food sovereignty, food security conference, and I heard this scholar speak, and he was talking about the mother culture and the influence of the environment around us and how it influences our choices and what we choose to do moving forward, and being aware of, you know, the impact of that on our overall health and overall lives. And I don't think we often realize that. I think within that there's a lot of psychology behind that. And so how these things relate to this question is that what I see when I go to communities, I've given presentations in a lot of reserves around BC, and I'd often talk about traditional foods. And what I hear from youth is that, you know, they often have questions like, what is traditional foods? What are you talking about? Because they're so used to more market foods, it appears. And when you go to the grocery stores, there are a lot of processed foods in those grocery stores, and not a whole lot of produce. And then just the market stores themselves are very different than what we're talking about with the traditional food systems. You know, you just go to the store and buy your food, whereas traditionally you would go hunting and move your body all the time. There's different health benefits to that. So how colonization has impacted these food systems, it really shaped our minds to be more dependent on these market foods, as opposed to, you know, utilizing traditional food systems and foods. With the youth that I was talking about, it seems like they're more accustomed to this tradition, not the traditional food systems, but the market foods, and, you know, what restaurants have to offer, as opposed to getting out there and being on the land and harvesting the food, hunting. And then I'd often, when I go to communities, another question or comments I would hear are, you know, industry has really impacted how we access those foods. So really colonization, in fact, impacted pretty much every aspect of our lives, really. Everything that we're doing is some form of influenced by colonization. So food sovereignty, going back to that first question, is counteracting that to really reclaim our health, in my perspective. So with a person that was staying with the comments around, you know, we don't have that access, and there's not as much food on the land anymore. I think colonization really shaped our minds and shaped our attitudes to, you know, pursue that knowledge, and because it does take a lot of initiative to really get into that, back into that lifestyle. It does for a lot of people. So I think colonization affects like our behaviors and the choices we make. It's much more easier to, you know, sit at home and not partake in that, moving our bodies around and harvesting food. And why it's so easy is there's a lot of distractions within our environments. TV, social media, video games, they're all kind of pursuing us to, you know, sit at home, as opposed to getting out there and continuing on the legacy of our culture. I'll pass that question on. I think I'm starting to ramble, and as Tatyana mentioned, this is a very big question. I think we can explore a lot of different areas and ways that colonization has affected Indigenous food systems. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, like, when you actually go out on the land, like, to get admin, like the uncles and the dads go out, and it's actually really heavy to pack salmon. And when I was working in the smokehouse a few years ago with my auntie, it's a lot of physical labor because you have to carry the wood, you have to cut the wood, you have to gut the salmon, you have to cut it appropriately for whatever food preservation you're doing. And then if you are making what we call dal, which is the half smoked salmon, it's a lot of muscles that I wasn't typically using because you have to put the salmon up on all of the hooks and everything. So it was a really big part of our physical activity. Like when we would go pick berries, we would kind of hike up the mountainside to get the berries that were ready to be picked. To carry a moose, it's like super heavy. It requires a few people to help out with that. So there was just so much physical activity within our daily lives, including like making blankets, through weaving. Every part of our Gitsan life just seemed to have been a lot of movement. So yeah, I don't know if that was relevant, but
Definitely. I think that's definitely kind of
Mhm.
goes into like a further question of like what are efforts being made to reclaim Indigenous foodways. And I think both Michael and Tatyana and Seamus and Gerry kind of all touched on different ways of reclaiming that, like moving your body and like getting out on the land and like connecting with your culture again, whether that be talking with your elders or other aspects of like connecting with the land or other aspects. Just wondering what your guys' thoughts are on that for reclaiming the efforts to be reclaiming the effort of Indigenous foodways.
Yeah, I just wanted to also highlight too, I feel like as I sit with this question on the screen a bit longer, I'm also reminded of the summer that many of us experienced this year, and we've been experiencing for many years, but that piece around, we've heard from Indigenous communities, we've heard from Indigenous folks who have been making noise about the changing climate, and it is frustrating, and it is a reminder that the changing climate and climate change itself, there is connection there, I do believe, as it is an impact from colonization as well. And I think it's something that has been sitting on my mind, where I think how can I use the power and privilege in my role to stand up and make noise to try and make sure that the voices are elevated, because I recognize that the voices and stories of communities may not be getting the attention that they deserve and they need to. And so how can I kind of elevate and amplify those voices? And that goes back to the piece around reclaiming foodways and whatnot. And that was one of the teachings that I've heard from my own creation story about then reciprocity and trying to share the knowledge that I've learned and try to use my power and privilege as a I've benefited from white privilege, and most people think I'm non-Indigenous, so I can get into spaces and I unfortunately have a bit more leeway to maybe ruffle feathers than a person who doesn't look like me. So how can I use that? And within the impacts of colonization, I also am thinking of that piece, like the Indian Act tried to kill Indigenous culture, but it didn't. And we're able to actually sit here in this virtual space as dietitians and as Indigenous dietitians and allies and actually talk about this. And that's powerful. And to hear from community what's happening, whether it's a few weeks back with when it comes to the salmon reintroduction project that is happening out here in the Kootenay area, and seeing the Shuswap First Nation actually putting releasing salmon into the rivers, and it, as one elder said, like, this hasn't happened for a long time. That's powerful. That's reclaiming and making noise. Yeah. And so it just, when I go and sit and listen to those stories from elders and community and youth, and you're hearing all of the great stuff that's happening in community, you realize that there's so much stuff happening that may not get all of the attention, but it is happening on the ground. And no matter how big the system is that's trying to push us down, we're still standing. So anyways, that's my little soapbox, but I just, yeah, I'm feeling it right now. And I really appreciate just, yeah, sharing space with everyone here.
Yeah, that's great, Seamus. And just to echo what Seamus was saying, I wanted to acknowledge all of the work that is going on throughout the province surrounding food sovereignty, because every community has some type of work going on there. And I think it's amazing that it's happening. And I think there's a lot of potential to grow things to further advance our Indigenous health and combat it, what it is today. And what I meant by what it is today, Indigenous health, is, I think Indigenous health, a lot of people talk about it in terms of, you know, what I mentioned earlier, diabetes, those leading causes of death, and talk about all of these colonial impacts. But as we established, Indigenous health goes beyond all of that and goes back. And there are ways that our traditional systems address those before they were issues. I also wanted to mention on Tatyana, you're mentioning, explaining a little bit of the more traditional food systems, and what I was kind of also getting at was that not everyone in community is in a place to go that route, as they're influenced by colonization to, you know, make different choices. An example of that is, you know, I talked to some clients about, you know, what are some great foods that are benefit our health if we eat them consistently, and one of them is salmon, and actually got and seafood, and actually get feedback like, oh, I don't like that, I don't eat that. And what they do eat is, you know, restaurant foods and newer colonial foods. And like, why is that? The colonization has impacted, you know, our a lot of people's mentality towards traditional foods sometimes, and that's very unfortunate. But so there's psychology behind that, and how do we work around that? And for me, it's like finding other foods that, you know, what else kind of replicates what salmon is providing, the protein, the different nutrients, the omega-3s in it, the different vitamins that are in it as well. And that just reminds me as well, like, how did colonization impact Indigenous food systems? Getting at, you know, traditional food systems. What I'm learning about our Gitsan food systems is that it's very diverse. Before, there's so much variety and different types of foods within the food system that I never knew growing up until I started pursuing that education to, you know, learn about it. And what I'm finding is there's such a wide variety of different types of foods. We're often thinking of like the big ones like salmon and moose, huckleberries, but there's such a wide variety of different foods within our culture that, you know, I never really knew about growing up. And that's an impact of colonization, losing that knowledge within communities. Like, there's so many different types of berries, there's so many different types of vegetables and root vegetables that were around the territory. So that's a way that I think colonization impacts food systems, is, you know, losing some of that knowledge over the years.
Definitely. Yeah. It's taking a step back and kind of reclaiming that, whether that be learning through our elders, or connecting with knowledge keepers, the land, and just trying to reclaim that. It's really great. Thank you. This leads to our last question before we go to the Q&A.
Add to that one.
Oh, yeah, you could.
something that I just thought of when the Mike was talking was about well, something that reminded me, brought up something in my head about the impact of colonization on Indigenous food systems, and particularly our Indigenous food trading systems throughout the Northwest. So we had the grease trails, and we traded ulakins, or we traded soap berries for ulakins and stuff like that. And that's not as strong in the modern day context with our nation-to-nation trading, because each nation may have different foods that grow within their land, and some may not. So that was a really big part of our history. And then also with food access, in terms of Indigenous food systems, I think food access is really important. A lot of communities in the North are very rural, and some are even really remote. So there's not a lot of choices for grocery stores, and I think that is a huge issue, because there's also not as much access to transportation in the North. Like to have a vehicle, it's really pricey. To have gas to go on a 2-hour trip to Terrace and 2 hours back is really expensive. So when I was growing up, we would go typically once a month and stock up on foods that will be preserved for a long time in order to have our food access for the month. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but there's a lot of issues when it comes to food access and transportation within the North, and that does have a huge impact on our modern day food system.
No, definitely that does. I think that's kind of touches on what Gerry was kind of saying at the beginning about the reserve system and how we were displaced from our community and had to be forced onto a reserve, and just highlighting what you were saying, like how we have to use modern day technology like cars and gas to get us going to these places, to get us food that's not even our traditional food, which is definitely an impact of colonization. So thank you for sharing that. This leads us into our last question. How can registered dietitians or governments, organizations, and individuals collaborate, co-create with Indigenous communities to strengthen their food sovereignty efforts? We'll start with Michael.
Yeah, I feel like we might even run out of time here because these questions are so thought-provoking, and when I hear like Tatyana speak, there's more thoughts coming up about how colonization is impacting our food systems and our health today. Her comments are reminding me of this community that I visited earlier this year, a very remote community, and they really focused on, well, their dependency is on this one community store. And walking through there's not really a whole lot of nutrition in terms of getting all of your needs through nutrition. And you hear about the stories about how industry has impacted their traditional food systems, like polluting a lot of the land and making the land food not appropriate to eat, and not accessible, and then they have to drive almost half a day to get to the next town to get groceries at a decent price, as opposed to their community store, which marked up a lot of the food costs for less nutrition. So yeah, colonization impacted our lives so many ways, and our health as well. And in this question here, how can RTs and governments, organizations, individuals co-create with Indigenous communities to strengthen their food sovereignty efforts? And I think, yeah, it's a great question, which kind of connects with the last one, because as a dietitian, I started doing contracts and working with organizations around these initiatives. And what I've been learning a lot about is the policies and mandates. They really limit to what you can do, I feel, to address these in a significant manner. I think they limit a lot of the staff employees, and so I think reshaping those policies and mandates and really reevaluating them often, and maybe even yearly, would be, I think, would be beneficial to ensure that they are keeping up with the needs of the community. And this question reminds me of a lot of the work that Don Morrison is doing, and I know that Seamus and Gerry, I have already mentioned Dawn. She's amazing woman, to amazing leader in the food sovereignty movement, and you learned so much from her. And one of the recent conversations that I had with her is their working group is like really trying to create like more independency and a true food sovereignty movement, in that they're able to determine like what the needs are and how to approach those, and trying to be independent from where these funding streams tend to go is through organizations, governments, and then they turn into a lot of grant systems as well. And these grant systems, in my opinion, often create more of a competitive nature between communities and nations, and I don't think that's the right way to go. So I think reevaluating a lot of the processes and the systems that are in place is going to be integral to Indigenous health and the food sovereignty movement moving forward.
Pass it to Gerry.
Thanks a lot. And I would build on what Mike says. Foundationally, for me, it boils down to, let's get rid of the Indian Act. That it mandates so many things that inhibit food sovereignty. There's things like the governance structure that it mandates, which is different than traditional governance structures. So can we turn governance back to communities? Can we ensure that communities are receiving enough money to support their community members? Because not only is poverty directly related to food insecurity, but some of the things that Tatyana has talked about with the distance to reliable grocers, and then further to that, a lot of times councils are placed in the position of having to sell foods that will generate income, and healthy foods don't necessarily generate the same levels of income as sugar sweetened beverages and highly processed foods. And so can we work to advocate for situations where governance structures are not so dependent on their grocery stores for income, and can use the grocery stores to provide nutritious and healthful foods. And then certainly last but not least is, I think that RDs and individuals and organizations can all be advocates for land back, because it's when people were relegated to reserves are largely, not uniformly, but largely poor land. And so if we can support the land back movement and help to again increase access to traditional foods, because people are currently constrained from accessing land for things like hunting, and that's because of land being inaccessible, because of the nature of reserves. And so anyways, we're all rambling here. It really comes back to supporting a change in governance structures and supporting land back, because those are the foundational things that will support long-term food sovereignty. Seamus said, I guess it's time for me to get down off my soapbox, but
Still thinking about how to answer, but what comes to mind right now is like individuals can also like learn and help educate others about what Indigenous food sovereignty is and the importance of it, to help support Indigenous efforts for food sovereignty. And I think something that is really lacking right now is funding for nation-based and community-led efforts.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what all of you have been talking about and sharing that piece around that, the kind of that larger action. And I think where I'm going to take this question is reflecting on two quotes or two teachings that were shared with me by two elders, and this idea around looking at where you sit as an individual and the kind of unpacking and going down your path of unlearning, and that comes with recognizing and acknowledging the privilege that you hold and all of the kind of intersections that comes with. And so I've mentioned in previous questions this idea of being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I remember when I was going through my education at UBC, Statliam elder by the name of Elder Gerry Ullman, which some of you are probably know of. I remember him sharing this idea that when you're doing work with Indigenous folks, when you're in the Indigenous health space, etc., you should be feeling uncomfortable at times. You should be having that uneasiness in your gut, because that is the guide to tell you, maybe we should pause, unpack why you're feeling that way, and trusting your gut. It's more worrying when we do this work when we're not feeling uncomfortable, that maybe we're not considering all of the pieces that are there. And so I've been on this path when it comes to kind of, unpacking who I am and my experience, and then unpacking how I can be, what it means to be a dietitian. I find that, going into community, showing up in spaces where you sit and actually listen, and reminding yourself about how relational a lot of this work is. Relationships are everything, in my opinion, and oftentimes as a dietitian, I have felt that I need to have all the answers. If I don't have all the answers and I'm going into community, I'm not going to be a quote unquote good dietitian or whatnot, but I've learned that actually showing up and being authentic, and really challenging myself to say, I don't know, or maybe not even saying anything. And more importantly, trying to ask really good questions, so that you have an understanding of what's actually being said, has been so valuable in the last year that I've been a dietitian. And then the other quote that I'm that's coming to me is I was sitting with a Silk elder by the name of Elder Leon Lewis at a food gathering last year, and I remember this conversation. We were talking about just my story and how I've been trying to soak in all this information as a dietitian, and also soaking in as much as I can of my own culture. And he shared with me that he's been Silk all his life, but he only knows this much of the culture. And I was like, holy cow. And just that reminder that, as health professionals, sometimes we want to know everything, and it can be really easy to slip into that mindset, but understanding that, yeah, it's okay to not know everything. It's more important to just show up listen really well and ask those questions. And finally, to wrap up, is like, I've noticed that sometimes as dietitians, we have the tendency to want to own things or own our projects or own our areas that we service. You know, it's my school district or all those kind of things. And this idea of owning things can also be problematic, and it can lead you down a path that you're not actually listening. You're your tunnel vision. So that was more taking this question to that individual piece of unlearning and just setting that path of what that journey is going to look like, and understanding it's going to take a lot of time. And it's okay. It's going to, if it takes time, but be open for that and sit with all that uncomfortableness. So that's all I got.
Thank you so much. I feel like you guys all gave like really great answers to the question and from your own perspective, and I think it was well answered. I think we're gonna go into the question and answer period. We have time for a few questions here. I have one ready. First question that I have is, if you could redesign dietetics education program to address historical and ongoing harms of colonialism, what would you change? And feel free to just, one of you, when you have the answer, to just hop on.
One small part of that answer is actually perhaps outside the dietetics education, and looks more at our food systems education, which tends to take place in the land and food systems courses, but bringing more information about Indigenous food systems. And there's a wide variety. I wanted to mention, we've all talked about Don Morrison, and I know, Serene, that you have Don on camera on your YouTube channel, so that's someplace that people can access Don's information. But it really comes back to a lot of what Seamus said, is we need to teach our dietetic students to unlearn.
Yeah, I really like that comment and agree with Gerry. The past few years, I've also explored and talked a bit about being uncomfortable. I think it's very important. When I go to communities and talk to when I speak in front of people and do presentations, I often open up with, even though they introduce me as a nutrition expert, I often say, like, I have more value being a learner and learning about the communities and the culture and the different types of food and what they can provide for us, as opposed to going in there and telling everybody what they need to do and acting as the expert. So yeah, I think that's very important as well. And that'd be great for students. For me, going through the dietetics program as a student, I often felt like I had to learn everything and know everything when I came out of the program. Whereas I don't think that was the case. I think it's more more valuable to acknowledge that we're not going to know everything, and what is great about the program is like developing that critical thought aspect of being a dietitian, which I really value right now, as well as like very core to dietetics is utilizing that critical thought, but at the same time acknowledging that we don't have all the answers on us right now, but we can likely look them up and find them. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done to, just trying to look at the question again, reduce the harms of colonialism. Yeah, so the apologies, I just realized I didn't say where I'm calling in from, and I'm calling in from the Silk Territory. And it is a little bit strange for me, just also thinking about, land acknowledgements and what that means. Often land acknowledgements, you're acknowledging that you're on unceded territory, and I just seen something where it said like unceded is a nice word for stolen, and so the stolen land that we're on, there's a whole history behind that, and what's more important to me is like what work is going into that, and what is the actions. I think that's very important for Indigenous perspectives, is we want to see that action happening as opposed to just kind of talking about it all the time, and just a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we're on this territory, but what are we actually doing to make a difference to counteract that stolen land?
Thank you.
I just saw this chat in the box from Jen Anderson, and it talks about ICDEP, and so ICDEP is our competencies that we need to have in order to become a dietitian. So I remember in my very first professional dietetics practice course, we were going through ICDEP, and then I noticed something about cultural safety, culturally relevant stuff. And then so I asked my professor, what are we doing to receive this ICDEP competency? And like, are we gonna discuss like Indigenous cultural safety and stuff? And that's when I realized that like there is a lot of work to do. I think there are so many opportunities to weave in this sort of education within our program, like learning more about the historical and ongoing harms of colonialism, but like how that impacts our relationship to food and our access to food.
I liked what you were talking about for cultural safety, and including that in the learning programs for dietitians. That kind of leads into our next question. Our next question is, how can we ensure Indigenous food sovereignty and security are respected and honored in the acute care setting, so that we care for patients and their families in ways that foster cultural safety?
Just going to hop in quickly and provide an answer that perhaps addresses this question, but also really addresses the last one, which is all of us have talked about learning from elders. And there's an unparalleled opportunity for the program to invest in more consultation with elders, whether that's the dietetics program at UBC or healthcare facilities, to support elders to bring their knowledge to the facilities.
Thank you, Gerry. Just wondering if any of the other dietitians had anything to add to the cultural safety question?
Yeah, I guess I can add to that. So I think it's great with this conversation in these past couple questions. We kind of talked a bit about cultural humility, and that we're learners and we don't know everything. So I think that also relates to seeking elders for advice and learning from them and through what they've gotten. To me, that's Indigenous storytelling, oral knowledge, passing on Indigenous knowledge, being passed on to and being utilized with what we do as dietitians. And I think that's very important for ensuring that these food sovereignty movements are respected and ensuring that they're going to be carried through in appropriate manners with respect to whatever culture they're working within. And I say whatever culture because there's over 200 First Nations communities in BC, and they're all going to be very unique to their own lifestyles. Yeah, and also going back to that, it wasn't a question, I guess it was Jen Anderson's statement about that topic can be a course in itself. Absolutely, I think so. And that when I was coming out of my degree, one of the questions I heard from the faculty was, how can we incorporate more Indigenous health aspects into the program? And my thoughts was like, well, we did this kind of Indigenous is like a side course where you could sign up, and it's a 2-hour course, crash course on colonization and how it relates to health. And one of my thoughts was like that should be a course within a dietetics program, and that should be kind of should be a priority, in my opinion. We're on Indigenous First Nations land and one of the most vulnerable populations, so why not have that as a core aspect of the program? And yeah, so I just wanted to comment on that as well.
I think I kind of got my thoughts together, what I was trying to say. So I was thinking like understanding like the context of where are they situated? Do they have access to a grocery store? Where are their food choices coming from? If they have a limited amount of choices of food, like how do you work with that as a dietitian in your practice? Like understanding more of the person and having more culturally safe person-centered care.
And if I could just, piggyback, Tatyana, I think that was the piece that I was trying to figure out how to articulate, and you articulated it. And I come at this question from I'm more in the population health space, but that the similar theme of being comfortable with meeting, whether it's a community, whether it's an individual sitting across from you, being comfortable with meeting them where they're at. So I know we have all of these quote unquote best practices or gold standard tools, but sometimes that can get in the way of just actually what is the person saying to me that I'm sharing space with, or community, and being comfortable with meeting them there. And then that it helps with that piece around strengthening and building that trusting relationship, so that whether it's a client or whether it's a friend, whether it's a community, they're open to now reaching out and learning more, or bringing you into conversations to help advocate for certain pieces. There's been times when I started where I was like, we got to do more upstream advocacy, and that was like what came out of my mouth, instead of maybe pausing and hearing, okay, we're having emergency food needs here, I will help you here. And then when we're ready, we can go on to the next part. But yeah, it's that piece about just being comfortable with meeting folks where they're at.
Definitely. And we'll end with this last question. I think a few of you can probably name some resources for this. But is there a resource that you find helpful for learning about traditional foods or Indigenous groups of people in different areas of BC? Is there a resource available to present to children under 5?
Maybe I'll quickly answer. It's not necessarily a quote unquote resource, and Tatyana, Michael, and Gerry probably have some great ones, but it goes back to that piece where you can like show up in community, go to powwows, go to events, and actually share space with folks and listen. That can provide such rich knowledge, and just allows you to reflect on where you're at. And I found that when if I'm going to a new community, or if I'm, one of the key pieces is what's the creation story? Usually they're available online, and I do sit and listen to that, because that helps ground me in a tiny bit of what's happening and what kind of values are guiding the community. So when you can, show up and go to go into community and share space and whatnot.
And I'd iterate that going into communities is absolutely the first step. It's also exciting that many communities are actually producing their own food guidance resources. So as well as going into communities and learning, you can inquire about what resources they have that the community has produced.
Thank you so much. I believe that's the last question that we can take for right now. We are really thankful for everyone and all our guests for joining us today. Thank you so much, Tatyana, Seamus, Michael, and Gerry, for the amazing discussion. It was great to learn about your perspective on Indigenous food sovereignty, the history of impacts of colonization, and then also just sharing your stories about why you pursued a career or your passion with Indigenous food sovereignty or Indigenous foodways and just food in general. Before we end this webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming webinars. Please sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All our webinars are free to sign up for on our website. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. And if you have any other questions or comments you guys want to share, feel free to speak now.
Thank you. I raise my hands up to everyone who sat and listened to all of us ramble and chat through and share some stories. And again, I'm honored to sit with Gerry, Tatyana, and Michael. It's always great to just listen to you all.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you as well to everyone who is sitting here and watching. Hope everyone was able to take some value out of our conversation here today. And I really appreciate the invitation from Learning Circle, and also all the work that Gerry has done in his career, and also making this happen today as well. I think Gerry played a pretty big role in bringing us all here together as well. And great job to my fellow dietitians as well, Seamus, Tatyana, and there are also other dietitians that collaborate closely with Indigenous dietitians in BC that I want to shout out to Jesse Newman, Rachel Dickens. They're also doing a lot of great work out there. And so yeah, thank you everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everyone.